I had been planning the move for 8 months. 8 months of spreadsheets, of saved floor plans, of walking through houses with that particular kind of hope that makes your chest feel hollowed out and full at the same time. So when I finally closed on the house on Callaway Drive, I didn't sleep the first night, not because I was anxious, but because I kept lying in the dark of my new bedroom listening to a silence that belonged entirely to me for the first time in 34 years of living. My name is Delaney Marsh. I'm a paralegal, I'm methodical, and I do not rattle easily. I say that not to brag, but to give you a baseline, because what happened in the weeks after I moved in would have sent a less grounded person completely off the rails. The house had been owned by a man named Terrence Pruitt. I knew this from the paperwork, from the title company, from the one-time I'd seen him briefly at the walkthrough where he'd been stiff and clipped and clearly unhappy about selling. My realtor, a sharp woman named Cora, had mentioned that Terrence had inherited the property from his late mother and had been dragging his feet on the listing for almost 2 years. She said it with professional neutrality, but I got the subtext: he was one of those sellers who resents the buyer simply for existing. I had no problem with that. I didn't need him to like me. I just needed the keys. Those first 11 days were, in retrospect, some of the happiest of my life. I painted the small office a soft sage green I'd been dreaming about for years. I hung curtains. I rearranged the living room furniture 3 times before settling on an arrangement that let the afternoon light pool across the floor in a way that made me stop whatever I was doing just to watch it. I called my sister, Priya, twice just to tell her about small, mundane things: a squirrel that had taken up residence in the oak tree out back, the way the floorboards in the upstairs hallway creaked in a specific spot that I'd already started calling the second step from the bathroom. Don't step there at 2 a.m. I sent her photos of the kitchen, of the garden, of myself standing in the empty dining room with my arms outstretched like I'd just won something. I tell you all this because I want you to understand what those 11 days actually were before I tell you what they became. The first call came on a Tuesday evening, 11 days after I'd moved in. I was still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, eating takeout directly from the container with one leg tucked under me on my new couch, watching something mindless on television. My phone lit up with an unknown number, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but some low instinct, made me answer. "You need to disconnect the camera in the hallway," the voice said. No hello. No name. Just that sentence, flat and clipped like a business transaction. I sat up straight. "Excuse me? Who is this?" A pause. Then, with clear irritation, as if I were the one being unreasonable, "Terrence. The previous owner. I forgot to disconnect the camera before you moved in. You need to do it." I set down my container. "There's a camera in my hallway. In the upper corner. By the linen closet. I use an app. I need you to disconnect it." I want to be precise about my reaction in that moment because it's important. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. What I felt was a specific, icy clarity, the kind I get in depositions when a witness says something that changes the entire shape of a case. My mind went very quiet and very sharp, and I said, "I'll look into it," and I ended the call. Then I sat there for a moment in my own living room, in the house I had bought and paid for and moved my whole life into, and I let the full weight of what had just told me settle over me. There was a camera in my hallway. It had been there when I moved in. For 11 days. 11 days. I started running through them in my head, almost against my will, like flipping through a photo album I hadn't agreed to look at. The first night, when I'd walked that hallway in the dark, disoriented, trying to find the bathroom in an unfamiliar house. The morning I'd done a little dance in my pajamas because the moving truck had actually shown up on time, a minor miracle. The night I'd cried quietly, the kind of crying that's mostly just exhaustion finding an exit, sitting on the floor of that hallway surrounded by boxes, missing my old apartment for reasons I couldn't fully name even to myself. All of it. Potentially all of it. I put down my food, stood up slowly, and walked to the hallway. It was exactly where Head said it was. Upper corner, angled down toward the front door, small enough that it blended into the crown molding if you weren't looking. A tiny lens. A small indicator light that was dark, not recording, maybe, or maybe just set to record without showing a light. I didn't know. I didn't touch it. I stood there for a long time, looking up at it, and I had the strange, vertiginous sensation of being watched by something that might already be off, might already be useless, but might also not be. The not knowing was its own kind of violation, separate from whatever the camera had or hadn't seen. What I did instead was go to my car, drive to a 24-hour pharmacy, buy a legal pad and 2 pens, and come back home. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote down everything. The time of the call. His exact words as best as I could reconstruct them. The location of the device. The date I had moved in. Every detail I could think of, organized into a clean timeline, because that is what I do when something is wrong and I need to think clearly, and then, because I am a paralegal and because I had worked in family law long enough to know that surveillance without consent is not a gray area in this state, I called my supervising attorney, Ren Castellano, at home. I apologized for the hour. She told me not to apologize and to tell her everything. By the time I finished, Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't disconnect it. Don't touch it. I'll make some calls in the morning." I said, "I was thinking the same thing." "I know you were," she said. "That's why I trust you." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house felt different now, not unsafe, exactly, but no longer entirely private, no longer entirely mine in the way it had been an hour earlier. I went around and checked every room. The bedroom, the bathroom, the office, the closets. I didn't find anything else, but I also realized I wouldn't necessarily know what I was looking for. These things are designed to not be found. I didn't sleep much that night, but not for the same reason I hadn't slept the first night. This time I lay in the dark and I thought about Terrence Pruitt and what he must have been seeing for 11 days. Me carrying boxes. Me ordering in and eating alone. Me walking down the hall at midnight in an oversized t-shirt to get a glass of water. Moments that were mine. Moments that belonged to no one else. And they had been watched, possibly recorded, possibly stored somewhere on a phone or a server or a hard drive with his name on it. The anger, when it came, was clean. Not hot and messy, but cool and purposeful, like a blade that knows exactly where it's pointed. Ren called me at 7:45 the next morning with the name of a digital forensics specialist she trusted. His name was Pax Alderman, and he came to my house that afternoon with the kind of quiet professionalism that immediately made me feel like things were being handled. He photographed the device without touching it, documented its exact position, confirmed it was a wireless camera connected to a cloud-based storage application, and told me, with professional restraint, that this was not an uncommon situation in property sales and that it was also not legal. "Has it been recording?" I asked. "The indicator suppression is a feature on this model," he said. "It doesn't mean it wasn't active." I nodded. I had suspected as much. "Hey Race, what I can tell you," Pax continued, setting his bag down on my kitchen table and pulling out a laptop. "These cameras log connection activity even when the indicator is dark, handshake pings to the home network, sync events to the cloud account. I can pull that log from your router without ever touching the device itself. That'll tell us whether it's been actively syncing, and when." It took him about 20 minutes, working quietly while I made coffee neither of us really wanted but both of us needed something to do with our hands. When he turned the laptop toward me, there was a long list of timestamps. Connection events. Sync events. Going back not 11 days, but considerably further, back into the period before closing, when the house had still technically belonged to Terrence, and continuing seamlessly through the day I'd gotten my keys and every day after. "It never stopped," I said. "It never stopped," Pax agreed. "What I did not do was call Terrence back. I know that might seem like restraint, but it wasn't, not exactly. It was strategy. Because here is something I have learned in nearly a decade of working in law, the person who talks first usually loses. Terrence had already called me to tell me there was a camera, which meant he was already nervous, which meant he already knew he had done something that could come back to him. Calling him back would give him information about what I knew and what I was doing. I wasn't interested in doing that. What I was interested in was letting Ren and Pax do their work while I kept my own counsel and waited. The second call came 3 days later. Same number, same clip tone, but this time there was something underneath it, a thin, high wire of tension that he was trying to keep out of his voice and failing. I haven't heard back from you, he said. About the camera. I've been busy, I said pleasantly. It needs to be disconnected. It's still connected to my account. I'm aware, I said. My attorney is handling it. Silence. Very loud silence. Your attorney? Yes. Ren Castellano. She's been in touch with a digital forensics specialist and we're in the process of documenting everything thoroughly before the device is handled. As I'm sure you understand, it's important that we follow proper procedure. He said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, the clipped professionalism was gone. What was left sounded smaller and more rattled. I just forgot. It wasn't intentional. That may well be, I said. But I'm sure you understand that whether it was intentional has some bearing on the civil matter and less bearing on the question of what actually occurred. My attorney will be reaching out to yours. I'd recommend you get one, if you haven't already. I hung up. I want to be honest with you, that felt good. I am a composed person by nature and I don't often allow myself to enjoy moments like that, but I let myself have that one, because I had earned it. After that call, things moved into a different gear. Ren had already been quietly building the file, but now she moved with more urgency, the kind of efficient momentum I'd seen her bring to cases at the firm dozens of times, except this time the case was mine, and the client whose interests she was protecting with such ferocity was me, sitting across from her in her office with a cup of tea going cold in my hands. Walk me through what you want, she said. Realistically. Not what would feel satisfying at 2 in the morning. What you actually want at the end of this. I thought about it. I want the camera gone. I want to know, as much as anyone can know, what was recorded and that it's been destroyed. I want him to understand, in some way that actually lands, that what he did was not a small thing. And I want this to cost him something, not because I need the money, particularly, but because consequences that don't cost anything aren't really consequences. Ren nodded slowly. That's reasonable. That's all reasonable. I can work with that. Over the following days, Ren and Pax built out the picture methodically. Pax's network analysis was the cornerstone. Those sync logs were difficult to argue with, because they weren't testimony, they weren't anyone's word against anyone else's, they were just data, timestamps generated automatically by a device doing exactly what it was configured to do. But Ren also pulled the title transfer records, the closing date, the date the camera's subscription service had last been billed, which, as it turned out, was 4 days after closing, charged to a card ending in the same 4 digits Terrence had used for an earnest money deposit 8 months earlier. People don't accidentally keep paying $11 a month for a camera in a house they don't own, Ren said, looking at the billing record. That's not an oversight. That's a choice he kept making, over and over, every month, until he got caught. She also did something I hadn't thought of, which was to quietly check whether this was an isolated incident or a pattern. She reached out, carefully, through channels that wouldn't tip Terrence off, to the listing history of the property and to a couple of contacts in local real estate circles Cora had connections with. Nothing came back conclusively, but there was a thread of something, a previous short-term tenant, years earlier, before the house had gone fully vacant pending the estate settlement, who had moved out abruptly after only a few months and left a vague, unresolved complaint with the property management company that had since dissolved. The records were thin, the complaint undetailed, and nothing could be proven. But Ren noted it in the file anyway, for context, she said, not for use yet. It was around this point that I got the third call, though this one came to me by way of a different number, a number I didn't recognize at all, and when I answered, it wasn't Terrence. Ms. Marsh? My name is Royal Antoine. I'm an attorney representing Terrence Pruitt. I understand you have legal counsel, and I'd actually prefer to speak with them directly, but I wanted to first extend, on behalf of my client, a sincere. You should call Ren Castellano, I said. I'll text you her number. And I did, and I hung up, because I had learned, over the past several days, the particular calm that comes from simply not engaging. Every word I didn't say to Terrence or his attorney was a word that couldn't be twisted later, couldn't be characterized as an overreaction, couldn't be used to make this about my behavior instead of his. Ren's conversation with Royal Antoine, which she recounted to me afterward with the dry amusement of someone who has had this exact conversation many times before, went roughly the way these things go. Royal opened with the forgotten to cancel the autopay angle, much as Terrence had tried with me. Ren let him finish. Then, in the same even, unhurried tone she might use to read out a grocery list, she described what the network logs showed, the unbroken chain of sync events spanning the closing date, the post-closing billing, the 11 days of active surveillance in an occupied private residence. She mentioned, almost in passing, that these matters tended to attract attention from local news outlets when they went to litigation, given how relatable and frankly chilling the basic facts were to anyone who had ever bought or rented a home. She did not threaten this. She simply mentioned it, the way you might mention that it looked like rain, and let Royal Antoine draw his own conclusions about what an extended public dispute might do to his client's reputation in a town where, as it happened, Terrence still had family and still did business. There was, Ren told me, a very long pause on the other end of the line. He asked, Ren said, whether his client could have an opportunity to make this right without it becoming a whole thing. And you said? I said that depended entirely on what making this right looked like, and that I'd be discussing options with my client and would be in touch. The back and forth that followed was, as these things tend to be, lengthy and dense and largely uninteresting in its particulars, drafts of agreements, red lines, a flurry of emails about indemnification language that meant very little to me and a great deal, apparently, to the lawyers. But I'll tell you the outcome, because the outcome is the part that matters. Terrence Pruitt agreed to a settlement that covered my legal fees, Pax's forensics fees, and a sum for the privacy violation that I deposited into a savings account I have now labeled, somewhat pettily but accurately, the kitchen renovation fund. He also had to confirm in writing, with a signed statement, that all footage had been deleted and the account was permanently closed, and, at Ren's insistence, he had to provide a sworn accounting of every login and access event to that cloud account for the entire 11-day period, cross-referenced against Pax's independent logs, so that there would be no ambiguity later about who had seen what, and when. What he did not get was any information about what I had done with my 11 days of private life. He will never know if I watched anything embarrassing, if I danced alone in my hallway, if I cried unpacking certain boxes that held things I hadn't looked at in years. He doesn't get that. That belongs to me. The camera was removed by Pax on a bright Thursday morning while I stood in my hallway with a cup of coffee and watched. He filled the small hole with spackle, smoothed it flat, and told me it would be ready to paint in an hour. I thanked him and he left and I stood there for a moment looking at the smooth, blank wall. That weekend, I painted over the spot myself, not because it needed a fresh coat, the spackle job was invisible already, but because I wanted to be the one to do it. I wanted my hands on that wall, doing something deliberate and constructive, the last word in a conversation that had started with someone else's hands doing something secret and intrusive in that exact spot. I put on music. I opened a window. I took my time, and when I was done, I stood back and looked at the wall, at the whole hallway really, and for the first time since that Tuesday evening phone call, it felt entirely like mine again. Cora, my realtor, called me a few weeks later for one of those check-in calls that good realtors make just to maintain the relationship. I told her, briefly, what had happened. She went very quiet and then said, very precisely, I am so glad you knew what to do. I told her ID had good training. For what it's worth, she added, ID had a strange feeling about that listing the whole time. He fought us on the price, fought us on the closing date, fought us on letting the inspector in for the second walkthrough. I chalked it up to grief. Maybe it was. But maybe it was something else too. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, about grief, and about how it can sit right next to something much less sympathetic, occupying the same chest, the same house, without either canceling the other out. I want to tell you one more thing, because I think it matters. A few months after everything was settled, I was doing a late-night reorganization of the linen closet, the one right below where the camera had been, and I found, pushed to the very back of the top shelf behind a stack of folded towels left by the previous owner, a small framed photograph. It was a picture of a woman I didn't recognize, older, with a kind face and Terrence's same dark eyes. His mother, I assumed. The woman who had lived in this house and loved it and left it to a son who hadn't quite been able to let it go. I held it for a moment, thinking about grief and attachment and the strange ways people try to hold on to things that have already moved on without them. I didn't feel sorry for Terrence. What he had done was a violation and he had faced real consequences for it, as he should have. But I understood, in some sideways fashion, that the house had represented something to him that went beyond property lines and title transfers, and that sometimes people do harmful things because they are trying to hold on rather than because they are purely malicious. I sat with the photograph for a long while that night, on the floor of the hallway, in the exact spot where I'd once cried from exhaustion during my first week here, in the exact spot the camera had once been pointed at. I thought about the woman in the photo, raising a son in these rooms, and about that son, decades later, unable to let go of a house that no longer needed him. I thought about how easy it is for love and possessiveness to look identical from a distance, and how much damage that confusion can do. I put the photograph in a small envelope, wrote his name on the front, and mailed it to the forwarding address Ren had on file from the settlement paperwork. He never responded. I didn't expect him to. But I like to think that somewhere, in whatever new place he's living now, that photograph of his mother sits on a shelf, and that some part of this whole ugly episode resolved into something that wasn't just legal paperwork and a wire transfer, something that was just one person returning something to another person, because it was the right thing to do, regardless of everything else that had happened between them. This is my house. Every corner of it, every wall and window and quiet hallway at midnight, belongs to me. I know that now in a way that I didn't know it before, not despite what happened, but in some uncomfortable way, because of it. Sometimes it takes someone trying to take something from you to make you understand exactly how much it was yours to begin with. I still eat takeout on my couch on Tuesday evenings. I still walk to the kitchen at midnight in an oversized t-shirt when I can't sleep. The floorboard on the second step from the bathroom still creaks, and I've never bothered to fix it, because at some point it stopped being an annoyance and started being a sound that means home. I live here fully and without apology, in every unguarded and imperfect moment, and not a single second of it belongs to anyone but me.